Charles entered the showroom like he had entered many rooms before, quietly, unobtrusively, as if blending into the backdrop where people didn't see him. But here, it wasn't any different. The gleaming luxury cars stretched across the space like works of art on display, their polished surfaces catching the sunlight just right. Every inch of this place screamed success, success that didn't seem made for someone like Charles. At least, that's what Derek thought as he saw the elderly black man, his weathered face hinting at a life that hadn't been easy, but a soul that carried it all without protest, walking slowly across the showroom. The subtle hum of the fluorescent lights, the clinking of keys from the salespeople's desks, and the distant sound of car engines from test drives could not mask the sudden shift in the atmosphere when Charles stood still in front of a car that most of them only dared to dream of. Derek saw him, of course, and not just any observer. He saw a chance to confirm his position. Derek had been in sales long enough to know the type. Charles didn't belong here. He wasn't the kind of man who bought cars like these. Not at his age, with his clothes, his look. A few seconds later, Derek confidently strolled toward him, already thinking about the cheap jokes he'd make under his breath to entertain the others, about how he could shoo this man away without losing face. Derek's posture was sharp, tailored. Everything about him screamed status, even when he stood next to someone who appeared to have none of it. He smiled as he neared, his grin far more superior than welcoming. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice thick with the kind of patronizing charm people like him used to manipulate situations without the others even noticing. "Can I help you, sir?" Charles gave him a single look. His eyes didn't show anger. Instead, they were soft, measured. But underneath that calm surface, there was something quiet, something strong. "I was just looking," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. A low chuckle escaped Derek's lips as he placed a hand on his hip. "Looking? Do you know how much this car costs?" He took a small step back, as if making a conscious decision to belittle without truly saying it. "It's not for everyone. Probably not for someone like you, anyway." Charles glanced over to the tag on the vehicle, his mind calculating silently. Derek couldn't understand why Charles wasn't immediately turned off by his tone, why this black man, older, humble, had the audacity to be so collected, while Derek treated him as if he were invisible. The man didn't belong. He wasn't supposed to walk among such men, act like he knew anything about these cars. He wasn't what Derek believed a customer like that should be. "It's not the price, son," Charles replied quietly, but his words cut with quiet force. "It's the craftsmanship that matters." He reached out and gently ran his hand across the car's surface, ignoring Derek's scrutinizing gaze. Derek could feel the slightest discomfort on his lips, but he wouldn't show it. Not here, not in front of the other staff. "You know your stuff," Derek said with a false edge of respect. But there was still mockery there, swirling just under the surface. He leaned in, arms crossed, every muscle in his body a stance of control. Charles nodded, finally meeting Derek's eyes. "You're right. I know these things, and that's why I don't need to ask. I know a thing or two about cars. Been around them all my life." Derek smiled wide, but this time there was a note of unease in his voice. "Oh, really? Well, we've got a lot of big decisions, sir, and we like to know that our customers are truly serious before they step into one of these cars. It's more than just paying, you know. A lot of people don't get that." Charles's expression remained neutral. He wasn't flinching. He wasn't angry. But there was an unmistakable fire under his calm exterior, a restrained power in the way he stood. "You should tell your boss that. Sometimes people who seem the least are the ones who know the most." Derek's eyebrows twitched, just for a second. But that was enough for Charles. Derek couldn't contain his next words. "Sure thing. I'll tell him you had some fancy ideas about cars, but to be honest, I don't know that we've got anything in stock that would meet someone like you's expectations." It felt too easy to be dismissive, so he did. Charles looked away then, toward another car. Elegant, powerful. He saw the tag. The cost was astronomical, but it didn't faze him. "That's funny," Charles said, his voice cool. He didn't flinch or back away. The words sounded too natural, like a simple statement but packed with unspoken weight. "Because I own this dealership." There was a slight beat of silence in the air. For a split second, Derek thought he misheard. "What?" Charles said it so casually that it couldn't have possibly been true. Yet the shock in Derek's face slowly started to stretch, the mocking grin pulling into tightness. "What?" Derek barked. "What did you just say?" "I said I own this place," Charles said again, in the same calm manner. His face didn't change. His body remained where it was. Derek stood there, speechless for the briefest moment. His lips opened and closed, unable to find an immediate response, an immediate insult. A part of him wanted to believe this was all a game, a joke. This guy didn't have the presence to even be in the same showroom as some of the customers he worked with, let alone claim ownership. Derek, finally stumbling for words, cocked his head. "You think? What? You own this dealership? I think you're—" "I am who I am, son. And that's why I'll be talking to your manager in a minute, when you're done wasting my time," Charles interrupted quietly. His words didn't shout, but the sting lingered in the silence they left behind. Derek's face flushed red under the pressure of his own misplaced assumptions, and he opened his mouth, ready to launch into his defense, when he noticed Charles didn't even wait for his words to finish. As Derek sputtered his confusion, his voice a whisper mixed with incredulity, Charles turned and walked toward the exit. But as he passed Mia, a soft voice caught him. "I'm sorry," Mia said, standing from her desk and coming to meet him near the door. Charles met her gaze. Hers was full of something closer to shame, but not quite. The door opened and Charles didn't wait. But Mia held his gaze a little longer. The hum of the showroom returned, the low buzz of business going on as if nothing had happened. The energy, though, shifted. Something had changed, and no one knew it yet. Charles looked out of the window, watching Tyrone pull up in his old, beat-up car. It was a Wednesday afternoon, the air thick with humidity, but Charles had become used to the weight of it. He wiped his hands on a rag and pushed the garage door open wider, allowing the scent of gasoline and oil to pour out. His hands, though wrinkled with age, were steady as he bent over the engine of his latest project, a classic Cadillac, its chrome polished and gleaming under the dim light of the garage. This was his haven. It wasn't just about cars. It was more than that. It was about pride, about remembering who he was, and how far he had come. He didn't look up until Tyrone's car stalled in the driveway. He chuckled to himself, knowing the exact sound of that engine. It sputtered and coughed like a breath gasping for air. Tyrone got out tall, with a slow swagger that still couldn't hide his youthful nervousness. He was wearing a hoodie, the fabric loose and a little frayed at the cuffs, a sharp contrast to the fresh, clean suit that Charles himself used to wear. "You made it here in that thing, huh?" Charles asked, his voice warm but teasing, with the same sly grin he'd had since Tyrone was a kid. Tyrone rolled his eyes. "You know I don't care about that car, Grandpa. But I got here, didn't I?" Charles nodded, pushing himself off the workbench. "You did, son, but someday you won't just get here. You'll get anywhere you need to be." He tossed the rag onto the table and wiped his hands on his pants, more out of habit than need. Then he looked at Tyrone with a serious expression. "It's all about the steps you take. You gotta keep stepping, even when people doubt you." Tyrone shook his head and smiled, but it wasn't a dismissive smile, more like a hopeful one. The kind of smile a son gives his father when they both know there's something beneath the surface of those words. Charles had been telling him stories like this since he was a child, tales of dignity, hard work, and respect, of perseverance in the face of adversity, of forging a path through what seemed impossible, and Tyrone had listened, but today was different. He was going places, big places. The letter from the prestigious business school was in his bag, and it had changed his life the second he opened it. But the excitement was mixed with fear, and even more so with a sense of disbelief. Could he really make it? Could he follow in his grandfather's footsteps, rise up, and not let the world swallow him whole like it had so many others? He sat down on the workbench next to Charles, reaching into his bag with hesitation, but when he looked up, Charles was watching him carefully. "What's wrong?" Tyrone hesitated but handed over the letter without a word. Charles unfolded it slowly, reading the words that were typed neatly onto the paper. His eyes flickered over the offer to attend the school, the chance to prove himself, the recognition that Tyrone had made it. He looked up at Tyrone, smiling with that quiet wisdom only age could bring. "That's my boy," he said softly. Tyrone chuckled nervously, running his hand through his hair. "It's huge, Grandpa. It's everything I've worked for. But sometimes I wonder if they'll accept me. I mean, it's one of the best schools in the country, and—" Charles didn't let him finish. He reached out and put a hand on Tyrone's shoulder, gripping it firmly but gently, just as he had done when Tyrone was small. "I never had what you have, Tyrone. But that didn't stop me from building everything I own." He motioned toward the garage, toward the cars, toward his workbench that had so many different tools neatly arranged. All these things, his possessions, his skills, his life, were earned through years of struggle. What had he gained from it? Not recognition, not love, but respect. That he could hold his head high for. "You've got everything you need," Charles added, a faint fire in his eyes. "They don't see you the way they see me, but trust me, you won't care about that when you reach the top. You keep proving it day after day, and you're gonna change everything." Tyrone nodded, swallowing his anxiety. "But what if—" "No," Charles interrupted him, standing up. "There's no what if. The moment they told you you weren't good enough, you take that doubt and turn it into something more than what they see. That's the kind of man you have to be, Tyrone. I'm proud of you, not just for the letter or for what you think you've earned, but for that strength inside you." Tyrone swallowed again, this time with purpose. He had heard Charles's stories his whole life, but now the weight of those words hit harder. He could see the glimmer of wisdom that lay beneath the worn-out clothes Charles always wore, the roughened skin, the quiet way he spoke. Charles wasn't just proud of him. He had fought to build himself into a man who had earned the respect he now gave Tyrone. And that was what Tyrone had to understand. The words didn't sink in immediately, but later that night, as Tyrone lay in bed, his thoughts raced. His grandpa was right. His whole life, he had been told that a young black man like him could only go so far. But wasn't this his moment to prove that there were no limits, no ceiling, no glass wall that could trap him? There was a fire in him now, something he hadn't felt before. He could feel it in his veins, a hunger for more, a hunger to earn the place he deserved in the world. And Charles had shown him how to do that. Through his work, through patience, through dignity. As Tyrone lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, it struck him. His grandfather wasn't just a mechanic, not just someone who worked on old cars. Charles had been someone who was built, piece by piece, from the ground up, from hardship to strength. And when Tyrone walked through that business school's door, he was carrying something greater than ambition. He was carrying a legacy. His grandfather's strength, his dignity. But Charles, he was used to hardship. He always had been. Charles closed the garage door, a faint ache tugging at his old bones. His hands still worked like they had when he was young. Sure, it was harder now, and things didn't come easy anymore. But if there was one thing Charles knew, it was how to endure. Just like he had all those years ago when his own father's passing had left him to fend for himself on the tough streets of a city that didn't care about people like him. He had fought and earned his place at the table of life. He had struggled through everything: racism, rejection, economic hardship, and every time he found his way to climb just a bit higher, even when they wanted to knock him back down. And now, as he stood in front of the garage, wiping his face from sweat and exhaustion, his thoughts were drawn back to one thing: respect. That's what he had learned growing up. The world didn't owe you respect, but you earned it. And what they saw on the surface, whether it was the gray in his hair or the faded overalls he wore, wasn't who he was. It was the man who could build engines with his hands, who could come up from nothing. He was bigger than they thought, and they would soon find out just how much. Charles stepped back into the dealership like he owned the place, but this time his mind was clear. This wasn't a visit for a test drive. This was a challenge, one he knew he had to face. His feet echoed sharply across the glossy floors, the hum of office phones and idle conversations ringing in his ears. Derek was somewhere, he could feel it. The familiar smugness, the eyes judging him, just waiting for another chance to strike. He scanned the room, moving toward the section of high-end cars again. The Cadillac from last time was still there, gleaming like it had just been driven off the showroom floor. Charles walked up to it, hands resting lightly on the hood, his face unreadable, the calm mask in place. He knew Derek would be watching. In fact, he probably wanted it this way. A few moments passed before Derek appeared, just as he had before. His slick black suit shimmered as he swaggered across the floor, the same false confidence radiating from every step. Derek saw Charles first and sneered. His colleagues looked on from the side, eager to see what would happen next. They knew how this game went. Charles would get a dose of humiliation, and Derek would win again. "So whack again, huh?" Derek's voice was loud, cutting through the air like a knife. Still dreaming about driving cars like these. He chuckled as if he had just told a hilarious joke. "Let me guess, just here to admire them from a distance?" The laughter from a few staff members and customers echoed behind him. A show, a clear mockery, a game they all knew well, but not to Charles. For him, it was another test of his own patience. Charles didn't flinch. He didn't look at the bystanders. They didn't matter. He focused on Derek, keeping his voice calm, steady. "I'm here to look at cars," he said simply. "Just like you. But you don't have to worry about me. You've got your crowd, and I've got mine." Derek grinned widely, the sharp edge of contempt already at work in his gaze. "Is that so?" He smirked, glancing around the room, relishing the attention. "What are you really doing here, man? I don't think people like you can afford this kind of luxury." The crowd around them shifted uneasily. They all heard it. The quiet racism disguised in Derek's tone, wrapped in the kind of superiority people like him had made a habit of displaying. They probably thought Charles wouldn't say a thing. They thought he would just back off or, worse, accept it. Derek, like many others before him, was counting on it. Charles's lips parted, and for the briefest moment, his eyes glinted with something else, something deeper. He let the silence hang in the air between them, sharp and full of tension. "Dreams," he said slowly, "are free. You don't have to buy them." The words hit Derek hard, but he wasn't one to lose face. Not like this, not in front of the crowd. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them with the easy confidence of someone who thought he had control. "You think that means anything?" Derek's words were louder now, calculated to humiliate. "People like you don't walk into places like this unless they've got deep pockets. And I'm talking about the kind of pockets that pay bills, not the kind that dream about owning a car they could never afford." Charles's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Derek didn't understand. He didn't see it. "I don't need your approval, Derek," Charles said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "The question is, do you need mine?" For a moment, there was nothing but stunned silence. The air in the room seemed to thicken, as if everyone was waiting for the next move. Charles stood tall, never losing his composure, his body language all quiet strength. Derek, however, faltered. He hadn't expected Charles to respond like this. Not in front of a crowd, and certainly not with such confidence. "Well," Derek scoffed after a beat, straightening his tie, attempting to regain the upper hand. "You know what they say, right? People like you belong in their place. Dream too big, and it's just a fall to reality. Let me save you the disappointment now." He motioned dramatically to the side. "Why don't you just head on out?" he said with an exaggerated gesture, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Come back when you're ready to make a deal that's worth it. There's no room for dreamers like you in this place." The laughter behind him grew, louder and more confident, but Charles remained calm. His gaze stayed on Derek with unwavering focus. "You'll find out soon enough, Derek," he said, almost cryptically. "This place might not be here for long if attitudes like yours are allowed to stick around." Charles didn't wait for a response. He gave the car one last look, eyes scanning it, taking in every detail. He could feel their eyes on him. The customers, Derek's peers. They were waiting for him to crack. But instead, he turned and started walking toward the exit, his steps slow, deliberate. He had made his point, but what mattered now wasn't the confrontation. It was the consequence that would follow. As he passed Mia's desk, he saw her look up at him. She was standing from her seat, as if unsure whether to speak. Charles paused, and their eyes met for just a moment. She was quiet, softly ashamed, maybe, but determined. As he turned to leave, Mia quietly slipped something from her desk into his hand. It was a small business card. No words, no explanations, just a simple message. "I'm sorry," it read. That was all. And yet in that tiny gesture, there was something more, an unspoken understanding between them. A silent acknowledgement that the battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. Charles took the card, slipping it into his pocket without saying a word. But inside, something stirred. He had been dismissed. Humiliated, yes. But he wouldn't let it stand. Not like this. Not by someone like Derek. The door closed behind him, but there was a shift in the air. Something had changed, and the game wasn't finished. Not yet. Charles leaned back in his chair, staring at the papers spread across the table in front of him. The silence in the office was heavy, the kind that pressed on your chest and made you question everything. His hand hovered over the sales reports, his eyes narrowing. There was a problem here, a bigger one than he had first realized. Derek's behavior, the culture he'd fostered, it wasn't just arrogance. It was toxic, and it was spreading. He hadn't been in this business for decades to turn a blind eye, but he had stayed in the shadows, letting things run, quietly orchestrating the sales empire from behind the scenes. What bothered him more than Derek's blatant dismissal, though, was how far the rest of the staff had fallen into complacency. His team of advisors sat around him, tense but waiting. He had already made his decision. They had reviewed everything: performance reports, employee conduct, customer complaints. Derek's smug face flashed in Charles's memory. The way he laughed at customers like Charles, mocking them like they didn't belong. "Everything's running smoothly, Mr. Charles," one of his senior advisors, Carter, said with forced enthusiasm. He wasn't fooling anyone, especially Charles. Charles didn't respond at first, letting the tension build. His fingers drummed lightly on the table, the sound quiet but deliberate. His gaze shifted from the reports to the faces of the people in the room, people who had stuck by him through all sorts of challenges. They saw his wisdom. They trusted him. But this was different. "Look at the staff, Carter. Look closely. Derek is undermining not only this place but also its people. He's fostering an environment that leaves no room for respect, for opportunity, for anyone except him." Charles's words sliced through the air like an accusation. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, suffocating them all. "We can't afford to run this kind of business any longer." There was a shift. The others didn't need to say it aloud. They all understood the truth. The toxic attitude was spreading, making people uncomfortable and less likely to come in, much less spend their hard-earned money at a place where they felt anything less than welcome. "Maybe it's time we do something about it," Charles said, finally breaking the silence. He stared directly at the young assistant, Mia, who had been quieter than usual. Something about the way she hesitated to speak caught Charles' attention. She had her own quiet strength, her own story. But today wasn't the day for that. Not yet. As if sensing his thoughts, Mia spoke. "Mr. Charles, I've been noticing something. Something that's been bothering me for a while now." "Go on," Charles encouraged, not breaking his gaze. Mia took a deep breath and pushed her hair back, her hands wringing the edges of her notebook in a way that betrayed the weight of what she had to say. "The sales numbers aren't adding up," she said. "On paper, everything looks fine, but when I talk to customers, I hear something else. Complaints about Derek's behavior. Disrespect, intimidation." Charles's expression grew hard, his fingers tightening into fists at the thought. Derek had crossed a line, and now Mia was putting it all into perspective. She wasn't wrong. Customers weren't just unhappy. They were insulted. Charles could feel the righteous anger rising in his chest, but he held it back. This wasn't just about his pride. It was about doing what was right. "What else have you noticed?" he asked. Mia hesitated, as if she feared crossing some invisible boundary. Finally, she spoke again, her voice quiet but firm. "It's more than that. Direct. He doesn't even realize what he's doing. The discrimination. The way he talks to people like me, underestimating us before we even have the chance. He's got his hands on everything, running the place like it's his, excluding anyone who doesn't fit his mold." Charles looked at her for a long time. He saw her struggles written across her face. The reality hit him harder than a punch. She had been fighting a battle behind the scenes, one that was invisible to most, one he was only now beginning to see. Her talent was being stifled by the toxic culture Derek had nurtured. But Mia had something more. He could see it in the way she carried herself, courage mixed with restraint, potential held back, but yearning for freedom. "You're more than this place, Mia," Charles said softly, leaning forward. "You should be running it." The words weren't a promise. They were a plan, a part of what was coming next. The wheels in Charles's mind clicked into place. He knew what he had to do. He had to level the playing field. It wasn't just about running a car dealership. It was about creating an environment where respect and dignity ruled, not hate or judgment. Derek needed to see that, needed to understand that Charles wasn't afraid to lose everything in order to fix what had been broken. Charles stood, his decision final. He walked over to the window, staring out at the dealership below, feeling the pulse of the place under his feet. This wasn't just about the cars or the money. It was about standing up for the ones who needed a voice. And Derek had crossed a line Charles wasn't going to let go unanswered. "We'll have to show him the consequences of his actions," Charles said slowly, his voice like steel. Mia stood straighter now, as though something had shifted within her. Her eyes sparkled with hope, and for the first time, she knew it wasn't just talk. Charles was serious. He was going to fight back, and she would help him. With the plan forming in his mind, Charles knew there was only one way forward. It would be bold. It would be deliberate. Derek had made one fatal mistake. He had underestimated Charles's capacity for patience, and now it would cost him. "Make sure the team knows what's at stake," Charles said to Carter, who had remained silent all this time, "and prepare for Derek's downfall. This time, we'll make sure everyone understands just what happens when you treat people like trash." As Charles left the room, Mia handed him a file that she had been working on quietly at her desk, compiling evidence, quietly tracking the patterns in Derek's behavior and the destruction it was causing. Charles glanced at the file. It was everything. Everything he needed to bring Derek down, to teach him a lesson that he couldn't unlearn. Charles stepped into his office, closed the door behind him, and sat down at his desk. He had a battle to fight, and he wasn't about to lose. But little did Derek know, this war had only just begun. Charles parked his car outside the dealership, the cool morning air filtering through the half-open windows. It was the kind of day where the world felt still, but there was an undercurrent of something stirring, something simmering just beneath the surface. He glanced at the rearview mirror, his reflection staring back at him, unreadable. Today it was different. Today he wasn't just the quiet observer or the man on the sidelines. Today he was the storm brewing. He stepped out of the car, the soft thud of his shoes on the gravel making a deliberate statement. He was here to change things, and he was prepared to be ruthless if it meant rooting out the poison that had seeped into his company. Walking through the dealership's automatic glass doors, Charles barely gave a glance at the glistening cars. His focus was sharp, his mind already running through the plan that had been forming in his head. Derek's reign of arrogance and humiliation was about to be challenged. It wasn't going to be a loud confrontation. It would be a calculated disruption. Today, Charles had come not just as the owner of the dealership, but as its reckoning. The showroom was abuzz with its usual chatter, customers eyeing cars, salespeople talking business, and Derek strutting around like he owned the place. But he didn't know that today the hierarchy was about to shift. Charles walked to the back office, his eyes scanning for Derek, the man who'd underestimated him from the start. The younger salesman didn't see him right away, too engrossed in a conversation with a customer. Charles smiled slightly. This moment was long overdue. When Derek turned and spotted him, the usual bravado cracked for a moment, his eyes widening in recognition. "What brings you here today, Charles?" Derek said with forced casualness, trying to hide the shift in his posture. "Just here for a look?" Charles took a breath and let the silence stretch between them. Derek was beginning to sweat, his overly polished image faltering. "Actually, I'm here for an inspection," Charles replied flatly. His gaze was steady, cold. "I think we've let things go on long enough." At the mention of the word inspection, Derek flinched visibly, but his smile returned too quickly. He didn't know what to make of it, and for Charles, that was a victory in itself. "I see," Derek started, but his voice trailed off. He adjusted his tie nervously. "Well, I'm sure everything's running smoothly." He gestured broadly to the showroom floor, as if trying to smooth over the unease. Charles said nothing. He simply nodded, a small but deliberate movement that left Derek to wonder what was coming. Meanwhile, in the corner of the showroom, Nia watched. She had been quietly observing Charles's movements from the beginning, noting how Derek's facade was faltering the moment Charles entered the room. Something had shifted. She wasn't sure what yet, but she felt a sense of nervous anticipation in her gut. There was no denying that Derek had made things hard for her, and in some ways she had felt invisible for too long. But now, in the shadows of this conversation, there was a glimmer of hope. As the day wore on, Charles moved through the showroom, methodically inspecting every department, observing the dynamics in play. He saw the cracks everywhere, the hidden animosities, the passive-aggressive tension in the air. But it wasn't until the team meeting later in the afternoon that he saw exactly what needed to be done. Mia was presenting some figures when Derek shot her a sharp look. His tone, dripping with condescension, cut through her words. "You're wasting our time with this," Derek sneered. "If you don't know the numbers by now, maybe you should be working in a different department." The others laughed lightly, Derek's usual act of supremacy, reinforcing the hierarchy. Mia flinched, her voice faltering for just a moment, but something changed inside her. It was subtle. The way her shoulders squared up just the slightest amount. The way her eyes darkened with frustration and determination. For a split second, Charles thought she might shrink away. But instead, Mia straightened and spoke with a newfound clarity that sliced through the air. "Actually," Mia said, her voice firm, almost too sure for someone who had often stayed silent, "I think we need a change in approach. These numbers aren't just about sales. They're about how we're treating people. Customers can feel disrespect, Derek. When people are treated badly, they leave. If we're going to improve here, we need to look at more than the figures on paper." She paused for a moment, challenging Derek's authority for the first time. The room went quiet. For a beat, there was nothing but the sound of the AC unit humming and the weight of eyes shifting between Derek and Mia. And for a brief second, Charles felt a flicker of pride. This was the moment she would step out of the shadows. But Derek didn't like being challenged. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightened. He gave a hollow chuckle. "Is that your best idea? Focus more on feelings and less on performance? That's rich. Your idea sounds fine in theory, Mia. But let's be real here. If you're not moving cars, you're not moving forward." Mia's heart raced, but she stood her ground, refusing to be cowed by Derek's words. She met his gaze head-on, but just as she was about to respond, Derek's cold smile returned. "We'll see if anyone else buys into that approach. I've been around longer than you, kid, and you'll learn your place in this company sooner or later." The attack on Mia was subtle, but devastating. Derek made it clear. No matter how valuable her ideas were, her position meant nothing. He had made sure of that. He would knock her back down, just like he had with so many others before her. And Charles saw it all, each calculated insult. As the meeting ended, Mia gathered her papers, the sting of Derek's words still settling in her chest. She wanted to leave, to escape to somewhere quiet where the suffocating weight of the humiliation wouldn't follow. But there was something else bubbling inside her, something that didn't let her run. She turned to Charles, who had remained silent throughout the entire exchange, a small, thoughtful look on his face. She couldn't help it. She walked over to him, her hand shaking slightly as she handed him the report. "Thank you," she whispered, knowing this wasn't over, but also understanding she had just earned a small victory. Maybe more than she had in years. The corner of Charles's mouth twitched upwards. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He didn't say anything. Instead, he simply gave her a nod, a gesture that spoke louder than words. Later that evening, Charles sat on the edge of his bed, the lights dimmed low, as Tyrone sat on the couch, his eyes locked on his phone, absent-mindedly scrolling through messages. "Derek made his move today," Charles muttered, his voice heavy with thought. Tyrone glanced up, sensing the tension in his grandfather's voice. "It's coming, isn't it?" Tyrone asked quietly, not needing to clarify what Charles meant. Charles nodded, the anger simmering beneath his calm demeanor. "I don't want to do this, Tyrone. But sometimes you have to fight fire with fire. I can't let him push people down without consequences." Tyrone stood up, moving to sit next to him. "I get it, Grandpa. But don't lose yourself in the fight. It's not worth it if it changes who you are. Be careful." Charles's lips pressed together. His fingers tightened around his cup of coffee. His eyes narrowed as he stared off into the distance. The conflict between his anger and his principle, his need for justice, and his desire to maintain his integrity was louder now than ever before. "You can't win if you play by their rules," Charles muttered, almost to himself. A heavy silence followed. But Charles knew what he had to do. The plan had already begun to take shape. He wasn't done with Derek. Not by a long shot. And when the time was right, Derek would feel it. In the most unexpected, most humiliating way imaginable, the dealer was about to turn the tables. Charles stood at the door of the dealership, his fingers clutching the handle like it was the first moment in a long-awaited confrontation. The cool morning air filtered through the slightly open windows, and for a split second, everything outside seemed to pause. The traffic, the chatter of the street, even his own breath. He stepped inside, no longer a humble bystander, but the man of power and consequence he had kept hidden for too long. He was no longer invisible, and Derek would soon see that. He was the storm that would knock over the Emperor's throne. This wasn't just a visit. This wasn't just an inspection. This was the moment. Charles didn't flinch when Derek's eyes locked with his. Derek stood in the middle of the showroom, his arm resting casually on the back of a luxury vehicle like it was the throne he deserved. The moment Derek saw him, he raised his eyebrows, the slightest hint of suspicion crossing his face. "Charles, didn't expect you to be here today. Come for a test drive?" Derek's smile was wide, but his eyes, those eyes, told another story. He could tell something was wrong, too wrong for his liking. Charles didn't flinch. He stepped forward, each movement slow, purposeful. His presence had power now, not because of his physical strength, but because of the quiet certainty that filled the room as he walked towards Derek. He wasn't here for confrontation. He was here for the reckoning Derek so richly deserved. "No," Charles said, his voice soft but carrying the weight of authority. "I didn't come here for a test drive." Derek's smug expression never wavered, but there was unease creeping into his voice. "Then, what is it, exactly, that you want, Charles? I thought you'd be more interested in your retirement plans." Derek smirked, as if daring him to respond. Charles's lips curled into a small but controlled smile. "I think it's time I explain something to you, Derek." As Charles said those words, Derek straightened, not sure what kind of challenge was coming, but feeling the unfamiliar twinge of fear gnawing at him. The room went still, and for a moment, even the constant hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed quieter. Staff members looked up from their stations, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. There was something wrong. Something was happening. Charles stood before Derek, towering in a way that had nothing to do with physical height. Derek's posture remained haughty, but inside, He felt a growing discomfort. The words weren't coming as easily now. "I don't think you understand," Charles said, his voice deepening as he let each word draw out, creating tension in the room that no one could escape. Charles's eyes locked with Derek's, piercing him with the clarity of everything Derek had missed. Every threat, every insult, every moment of doubt. "I own this dealership." The words came slowly with finality. Derek's face paled in disbelief. He froze for a moment, blinking like he didn't fully process what had just been said. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. No one in his circle, no one with power, would ever stoop to such a level. "No," Derek stammered, trying to mask the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. "You can't. You don't even." Charles raised a hand to stop him. "I said I own this place." His words filled the room. The staff, the customers milling around, the corporate leaders who had been quietly observing, all turned their gaze to the confrontation. Derek was losing control. This wasn't the scenario he had imagined. This wasn't the version of events he had crafted in his arrogant, narrow mind. "I've been running this place for years, Derek," Charles continued, his voice colder now, every inch the man who had built this empire from nothing. "I've watched from the sidelines as you've humiliated my employees, belittled my customers, and dismissed anyone who didn't meet your idea of worthy. And now it's time for accountability." Derek stumbled back a step, his arrogant facade completely gone. His mouth moved, but no words came out. How was this possible? How was Charles the owner? It didn't make sense to him. His brain fumbled for some explanation, but it didn't find one. Not in this moment. "Derek," Charles said, his voice booming in the sudden silence that had settled over the showroom. "You've built this culture of pride and exclusion. You've decided that people like Mia, people who aren't like you, don't matter. But today, I'm showing you what matters." All eyes were on Charles now. His calm demeanor seemed to shatter Derek's world. He had never expected anything like this. Charles wasn't finished. This was only just beginning. "I think it's time for a change," Charles said, finally turning to Mia, who was watching from the side. She stood taller now, her back straight, her eyes defiant. She had endured Derek's condescension for far too long, but now, with Charles's words, her world was shifting. "Mia," Charles called, turning to her. The moment her name left his lips, every eye in the room followed her. She took a slow breath, gathering her courage, and stepped forward. Derek watched in disbelief, his chest tightening. "Charles," Mia said, her voice steady, her confidence no longer trembling under the weight of Derek's snide remarks. "I know you've been watching, and you're right. It's time for a change." Charles's face softened with approval. He stepped aside, allowing Mia the spotlight she had deserved long before now. "This is Mia," Charles announced, his voice strong and resolute. "The new manager of this dealership. She has earned the respect this place has denied her, and I am proud to promote her today, right now." Gasps rippled through the room. For a moment, silence reigned, before the staff and customers began to shift uneasily. It was happening. Mia was being recognized. Derek wasn't. Derek was crumbling. But Charles didn't stop there. He was in complete control now. "And Derek?" Charles said, his gaze never wavering from the trembling figure in front of him. "You're going to take some time away from this dealership. You'll be walking out the door. And when you do, don't bother coming back." Derek opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. All the power he had held was gone, disintegrated by Charles's calculated words and the truths Derek had ignored. The customers began to murmur, some in disbelief, others in surprise, but most in awe of the way Charles had taken control of the situation. And Mia, standing a little taller, a little stronger, felt the smile tug at the corners of her mouth. For the first time in a long while, Mia believed in herself. Charles didn't look at Derek as the defeated salesman stumbled away from the showroom, his path blocked by the eyes of everyone in the room. He was dismissed, no longer the towering force he thought he had been. Mia stood at the front of the showroom now, the future hers to shape, her heart pounding, but a smile playing on her lips as the room fell into a new kind of stillness, the kind that promised hope. And Charles, standing just behind her, let the final ripple of change sweep through the dealership. He had fought for what was right, and he had won. Outside, the wind picked up, the air colder now than when Charles first entered. He knew Derek wasn't the only thing that needed to be removed. This place, too, needed new breath. It needed new life. And Mia, she would be the one to lead it all. But for now, Charles watched as the future unfolded in front of them. This was only the beginning. Derek stood at the edge of the showroom, his back rigid, sweat beading on his forehead. It was surreal. Everything was moving too fast, too chaotically. He had been the one in control for so long, pulling strings behind the scenes, managing the dealership's environment with a careless confidence, never thinking there would come a day when it all fell apart. And yet, here it was. Charles was standing in front of him, looking like a man reborn, ready to deliver justice, and Derek could feel it coming. The room was still, thick with tension. The employees, the customers, all were watching with bated breath as Derek's universe slowly, agonizingly collapsed. His pride had been his shield, his arrogance a weapon, but it had all come crashing down under the weight of a few simple words. "I think it's time you leave, Derek," Charles said, his voice cold but not unkind, every syllable cutting through the silence with a sense of finality. "You've treated people in ways that have no place in my dealership. You've humiliated them, belittled them. Your time here is over." Derek didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. His breath was shallow, each inhalation and exhalation pulling him deeper into his own disgrace. He had underestimated Charles. No, he had underestimated the dignity of the very people he thought he could push down. The workers around him had begun to whisper, some with nervous glances, others with emboldened silence. But Charles, still standing tall, had won. As Derek was escorted to the back office, Charles didn't even need to look back. He could feel the eyes of every person in the room watching him, waiting for the next move. There was a ripple of murmured approval. Customers who had overheard the confrontation began exchanging glances, some even nodding as if they, too, could sense the weight of what had just transpired. The door slammed shut as Derek disappeared, and Charles turned to face the room full of people. Every single person in that showroom had seen Derek's shameful exit, but they weren't the only ones witnessing change. Charles wasn't going to stop with just Derek. Not today. "I think it's time we all take a long look at the kind of dealership we want to be," Charles said, addressing the room with a commanding authority. The staff all turned towards him, their faces marked by fear, confusion, and, in some cases, hope. Charles turned to Mia, who stood in the back, her hand nervously gripping the edge of her folder. He could see the uncertainty, the nervous glances. "Mia," he said, his tone firm but not harsh, "I'm putting you in charge. Effective immediately, you're the new manager." Mia's heart skipped in her chest. She looked around, stunned, feeling the weight of Charles's words settle on her. The room seemed to blur for a moment, but when her gaze returned to Charles, she saw the quiet trust in his eyes. "I thank you," she whispered, barely able to find her voice. "No," Charles replied with a slight shake of his head. "Thank you for doing what I should have had the courage to do long ago. You've earned this, Mia. We're going to change things here, and you're going to lead it." The words hung heavy in the air, powerful, like a promise. For the first time, Mia allowed herself to truly see it, herself in charge, leading with dignity, not for the approval of others, but for the respect of her community. This moment wasn't just a victory for her. It was a victory for anyone who had ever been dismissed because of who they were. As Charles stepped aside, a few employees nodded. They had watched as the tension shifted between Derek and Mia, the power dynamics beginning to evolve with subtle movements. Mia's mind was racing, but she didn't let the opportunity slip through her fingers. She had a future to shape, and today, with Charles's unwavering support, that future was now in her hands. "Starting tomorrow," Charles continued, his voice lifting once again as he addressed everyone in the showroom, We're going to implement cultural sensitivity training for everyone. No more excuses, no more tolerance for the kind of behavior that was allowed to fester here. This place is about respect for everyone." The nods of approval came slowly at first, then with more confidence. The weight of Charles's words wasn't just heard, it was felt in every corner of the room. They were at the beginning of something greater than anyone had imagined. A ripple of genuine hope spread out from the epicenter, one that could not be undone. As the moment stretched, Charles turned back towards Mia, locking eyes with her just briefly. The smile he gave her was one full of trust, and though the others would never understand the depth of what they had just accomplished, he knew that Mia would lead them into a new era. No longer would employees live under the shadow of Derek's cruelty. No longer would anyone be able to hide behind pretenses of superiority. The stage was now set for a completely new legacy at this dealership, one where respect was non-negotiable. The days following Derek's disgrace unfolded differently. The ripple of change, though slow at first, was inevitable. Customers saw the difference. Employees felt the change in the air. Mia, under Charles's mentorship, began to blossom into the leader everyone could rally behind. She didn't just manage, she inspired. She didn't just supervise, she led with a quiet dignity that reached every corner of the dealership. The customers, once cautious, now came to see this new chapter of the dealership for themselves. More than once, they complimented the new direction, praising the atmosphere that had suddenly shifted. It wasn't just about buying a car anymore. It was about being treated like a human being. Charles observed all of it with quiet pride. He watched as Mia transformed from someone simply filling a gap to a true leader, empowering others, creating a culture of trust. His decision to confront Derek was a small victory in a much larger fight. A fight that would be won by doing things the right way, even when it was the hardest choice to make. And for Derek, his reputation crumbled. The customers, the employees, even the competitors knew the truth now. His name was no longer a symbol of power or influence. It was a warning. Weeks later, when the first customer came in to shake Mia's hand after the changes were fully implemented, the words they shared felt like confirmation. "It's different here now," they said, smiling at Mia as she greeted them warmly. "It feels right." Mia knew then. She knew they had turned a page. And as she stood there, taking her rightful place, surrounded by customers who felt safe, staff who felt appreciated, and a dealership that truly embodied respect for all, Mia understood what true leadership was. It was the ripple that started from one action and slowly, patiently changed everything. It was justice, it was redemption, and it was only the beginning. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the peaceful street. Charles sat in his favorite chair, the one worn with age but comfortable, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee as he watched his grandson, Tyrone, clean his shoes on the porch. The breeze carried the faint hum of life in the neighborhood. The sounds of kids playing, cars driving by, distant chatter. It was the kind of evening that made you believe in the calm after the storm. Tyrone had been different ever since the big day of the dealership. Something in him had changed, grown. It was subtle, yet visible. Every word he spoke now carried weight. Every movement, every glance seemed sharper. His grandfather noticed it immediately. And tonight, as the light faded and night took over, Charles felt a moment of reflection. Tyrone looked up, catching Charles's gaze, and smiled. But it wasn't the smile of a boy trying to prove something anymore. It was the smile of someone who understood. "You've really grown, boy," Charles said softly, his voice carrying a thread of pride that only comes with watching a young soul shift from uncertainty to confidence. "I can see it in your eyes." Tyrone paused, the rag still in his hand as he looked at Charles, contemplating. "I'm trying," he said, his voice thick with the sincerity of someone who had only recently realized the gravity of his purpose. "You've always told me patience is key, Grandpa. Watching what happened at the dealership, it made me see what you meant." Charles leaned back, letting the moment wash over him. A smile, small but deep, tugged at his lips. His fingers rested on the old leather armrest as he began. Tyrone, sometimes you think change has to come all at once. That's the way the world seems to be moving. Fast. Loud. But real change takes time. It's like this chair here. Charles ran a hand over the faded wood and leather, its edges worn from years of use. It didn't get this way overnight. It took patience, action. It doesn't happen in a flash. But once it's done, well, it's solid. Like this chair, like your foundation. Tyrone sat down beside him on the porch, leaning back in the worn wicker chair as the evening grew cooler. He listened closely, absorbing his grandfather's words, every piece of wisdom sinking deeper into his heart. Charles continued, knowing that these were the lessons Tyrone needed more than ever. When I took over the dealership, I didn't do it to impress people or to make anyone kneel before me, Charles said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. I did it because I knew change couldn't come without a strong foundation. Derek's arrogance, it wasn't just something personal. It was systemic. I had to uproot it. Slowly, steadily. Like pulling out weeds, you wait for the right time. Then, when it's done, you plant the right seeds to grow something better. Tyrone nodded, looking down at his hands. I'll take that to heart, Grandpa. I know the world isn't as simple as it looks sometimes. It's easy to get caught up, but you showed me you can't rush everything. He paused, his eyes glinting in the fading light. I'm going to follow your example and go into this world with the same principles you've taught me. Charles smiled, finally allowing himself to relax, content with what he saw before him. His hands rested gently on his knees as he breathed deeply, enjoying the peace. Tyrone was ready, more than ready. A car passed by on the street, its engine humming as it disappeared into the horizon. Charles stood up slowly, the age in his joints unmistakable but the pride in his heart outweighing everything else. Come on, let's go for a drive, son. You need to see something. The two of them climbed into the classic Cadillac, the same one Charles had kept lovingly for years. Its engine rumbled to life, echoing the quiet power behind it. As they drove down the street, Charles turned to Tyrone, the old car's dashboard light reflecting off his face. Tyrone, Charles began, the weight of his words carrying into the still air. Sometimes justice is delayed, but patience is its own victory. Tyrone looked at him, a quiet understanding passing between them. He had seen his grandfather's strength, the way he faced everything, every injustice, every hardship, with unwavering patience, choosing action over reaction. You taught me that, Grandpa. Charles nodded slowly. He didn't need to explain further. The words, once heavy with years of wisdom, were now settled between them. The world changes, son, when people like you take the reins. But remember, it's about leading with dignity. If you never lose sight of that, the world will follow. The streets passed in a blur, the dealership now in view. Charles could see it through the rearview mirror, bustling with customers, lights illuminating the showroom floor where Mia worked. Now fully in control, her leadership respected and embraced. It felt right. His vision, the seed planted years ago, was finally blooming. He didn't have to prove anything to anyone anymore. As they passed the dealership, Charles slowed the car, looking at the lot one last time before making his way down the road, the streets and homes glowing in the evening twilight. A sense of calm washed over him. He had built something lasting, not just a business, but a community, a place where respect, hard work, and honor ran through the air like the blood of those who had come before him. The sun had set now, but the feeling of hope, like a long-awaited dawn, rested in the air. Charles felt it in his bones, in the quiet but resolute way the world had shifted, inch by inch, through patience, action, and the undeniable wisdom that only time could give. We did it, Tyrone, Charles whispered to his grandson, the soft hum of the road underlining his words. And now you'll keep it going, for all of us. Tyrone looked over at his grandfather, the road ahead stretching far and wide, full of possibility. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew this. He would carry his grandfather's lessons with him wherever he went. Charles drove on, passing the vibrant life behind the dealership, with a contented smile on his lips. The legacy was no longer his alone. Tyrone would carry it forward. The ripple effect had already begun. They drove off into the night, the car's engine a steady, comforting hum, a sound that would carry them, carry his family, carry his values into the generations to come. And they say justice delayed is justice denied, but patience is its own victory. The road ahead was long, but now it was theirs to shape.